blood and dust. The auction yard reeked of both as Sarah Whitford stood chained beside a trembling bay mare, her bare feet burning on sun-baked earth. September heat pressed down like divine judgment, while jeering men circled the platform like vultures around fresh carrion. The iron shackles bit into her wrists, but she bit her lower lip until it bled rather than cry out a small act of defiance that her mother's memory deserved. Sarah's fingers found her mother's ring beneath her torn sleeve, a thin band of tarnished silver that held 13 years of memories and whispered prayers. "Stay strong, little mouse," Mama's voice echoed in her mind. Truth always finds the light. But standing here chained like livestock while men bid on her flesh, truth felt as distant as rain in this godforsaken desert. "Now here's a bargain for you boys." Victor, the auctioneer's voice, cracked like a bullwhip across the dusty yard. His gold teeth gleamed as he grabbed Sarah's chin with grimy fingers, forcing her face toward the jeering crowd. Deaf as a post, but twice as useful. Perfect for them jobs nobody else wants to touch. She didn't flinch, wouldn't give them the satisfaction. But her grip on the ring tightened until she felt her mother's spirit flowing through the silver. In the crowd, she spotted Deputy Amos Hale, barely 25, and sweating bullets despite the shade of his hat brim. His hand kept twitching toward his gun, his conscience clearly at war with his orders. A drunk miner pushed forward, his breath reeking of rot-gut whiskey and broken dreams. "Let me get a closer look at the merchandise." His grimy hands reached for Sarah's arm fingers, already imagining their destination. "I got uses for a girl who can't scream." That's when he pulled the knife. The blade flashed in the afternoon sun as the drunk lunged forward, whiskey courage making him bold. Sarah twisted away, but the chain limited her movement. The crowd pressed closer, sensing violence like sharks smelling blood in the water. The gunshot split the air like the crack of doom itself. Wyatt Callahan's bullet shattered the drunk's wrist, sending the knife spinning into the dust while the man screamed and clutched his ruined hand. Chaos erupted as men scattered like startled chickens, some diving for cover, others reaching for their own weapons. Smoke curled from Wyatt's Colt as he stepped through the pandemonium, his spurs ringing against the hardpan like death bells tolling. At 35, Wyatt's weathered face bore scars from battles that had claimed better men. The jagged line running from his left ear to his jaw told the story of Powder River, where he'd survived by playing dead under his brother Tom's corpse for 6 hours. But his steel-gray eyes held something the crowd recognized and feared: death walking upright in human form. "I'll take both," Wyatt said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute finality. His left hand rested casually on his belt buckle, but everyone there knew the stories. The whispers followed him like shadows. Wyatt Callahan, the one who rode with Custer until he saw the writing on the wall. The one who lived when his whole company died at Little Bighorn. The one who never misses. "A girl and horse? Name your price." The auctioneer's gold-toothed grin faltered as he glanced nervously at the crowd. "Now, mister, you sure about that? Sheriff Thorne don't much like folks interfering with official auctions." I said I'll take both. Wyatt's hand never moved from his gun belt. But every man there felt the promise of violence hanging in the air like heat lightning. "Unless you prefer to discuss it with my Colt." As coins changed hands and chains fell away with metallic clanks, Sarah looked up at her unlikely savior. His eyes met hers for a moment, not with pity but with recognition, as if he too knew what it meant to carry secrets that could destroy innocent souls. She saw something else there, something that made her heart skip the same haunted look she glimpsed in her own reflection when she dared to look in mirrors. An old-timer in the crowd spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust, his rheumy eyes fixed on Wyatt, with something between respect and pity. "You best watch your back, Callahan. Sheriff Thorne's got his eye on that spread of yours. This here stunt just gave him all the excuse he needs." But Wyatt was already leading Sarah and the bay mare toward his black gelding, the weight of watching eyes heavy on his shoulders. In the distance, heat mirages danced on the horizon, or perhaps they were omens of the storm gathering around them all like circling wolves. The Callahan Ranch lay 8 miles beyond San Jacinto Mesa, where the desert met the mountains and a man could disappear into vastness if he chose. Wyatt had learned to live with ghosts in this harsh country, where the wind carried voices of the dead and every sunset painted the sky the color of blood. Sarah arrived at his barn shivering despite the heat, clutching a battered tin box against her chest like armor. Her dress was little more than rags, her feet cut and bleeding from the rocky ground. But her storm-cloud eyes held depths that seemed impossible for someone barely 18, as if she'd already seen more than her share of the world's cruelty, and somehow survived with her soul intact. "Easy now," Wyatt murmured, approaching slowly, as he would a wild mustang. Sarah watched his lips move, her head tilted slightly, and something flickered across her face. Not just recognition, but understanding. That went beyond words. She was reading him. He realized the same way she'd read the hostile crowd at the auction. The bay mare whinnied softly from her stall, and Sarah turned toward the sound with sudden alertness. Without hesitation, she moved to the horse's side, her movements fluid and sure despite her obvious exhaustion. The mare, who had shied away from every man who tried to approach, immediately calmed under Sarah's gentle touch. "Well, I'll be damned," muttered Jake Morrison, emerging from the tack room with a saddle over his shoulder. At 60, Jake had worked cattle all his life, his weathered face telling stories of drought and plenty love and loss. His wife, Martha, had died of fever 3 winters past, leaving him with nothing but memories and an old dog named Soldier. "Ain't seen nothing like that since my grandmother talked to horses back in Missouri. That woman could gentle a bronc with nothing but whispers and patience." Sarah's fingers traced the mare's neck, finding old whip scars and healing wounds with the practiced touch of someone who understood pain intimately. Her face hardened with something like controlled fury, though she made no sound. The anger was cold, calculated, more dangerous than any hot rage could ever be. She looked back at Wyatt and pointed to the horse, and then to herself, and then made a gesture, as if breaking something in two with her bare hands. The message was unmistakable. "Both been broken, is that it?" Wyatt asked quietly, his voice carrying the weight of his own unhealed wounds. Sarah nodded once, then knelt beside her precious tin box. Inside, wrapped in faded calico that had once been her mother's best dress, lay a few precious things: a wooden comb carved with roses, a pressed flower from her mother's garden, a small knife with a bone handle, and at the bottom, carefully hidden beneath everything else, a photograph of a woman who shared Sarah's storm-cloud eyes and determined jaw. "Your mother," Wyatt guessed, recognizing the fierce intelligence that seemed to run in the family. Sarah's face crumpled for just a moment, revealing the frightened girl beneath the armor of silence. But she quickly sealed the crack in her defenses, tucking the photograph away with trembling hands. When she looked at him again, her expression was resolute. She pointed to the barn, then to herself, asking a question without words. "You can stay," Wyatt said, surprised by how much he meant it. "Long as you need. This ranch has seen its share of broken souls looking for shelter." But even as he spoke the words, he wondered what he'd brought into his carefully ordered world. In the distance, a coyote howled, and the sound carried on the desert wind, like a warning of storms to come. And somewhere in the gathering darkness, he could have sworn he heard the echo of hoofbeats, someone watching, someone waiting. 3 days later, Wyatt woke to the sound of thrashing hooves and panicked whinnying that sent ice through his veins. He grabbed his Winchester and ran barefoot to the barn, expecting rustlers or maybe a mountain lion. Instead, he found Sarah kneeling in the blood-soaked straw beside Copper, his prize young stallion, who was down and convulsing with the worst case of colic he'd ever seen. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," Jake whispered, appearing with a lantern that cast dancing shadows on the barn walls. "Been fighting it near 2 hours now. Started just after midnight. I was fixing to wake you when the girl here showed up." The horse's eyes rolled white with agony, foam flecking his muzzle as his intestines twisted into deadly knots. Wyatt had seen it before. Horses could die from colic in hours, their bodies turning against them in ways that made strong men weep. The usual treatment was a bullet behind the ear, quick and merciful. "Fetch the rope and hobbles," Wyatt ordered grimly. "We'll have to put him down before he suffers any more." But Sarah was already moving with purpose and confidence that seemed impossible for someone who'd never worked a ranch. She placed her hands on Copper's heaving flank and began to hum, not with her voice, but deep in her chest, a vibration that seemed to travel through her bones and into the dying animal. The stallion's ears twitched toward her, and gradually, impossibly, his thrashing began to slow. Wyatt watched in amazement as Sarah's fingers found pressure points along the horse's belly, pressing and releasing in rhythm with the animal's labored breathing. Her face was a mask of intense concentration, sweat beading on her forehead, despite the cool night air. For 40 minutes, she worked in absolute silence, her hands never ceasing their gentle but firm pressure. She seemed to be fighting a battle that only she could see, her entire being focused on saving a life that everyone else had given up for lost. Gradually, Copper's breathing eased and his eyes began to clear. When he finally rolled to his feet and shook himself with a grateful nicker, Wyatt felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of a knot he hadn't even realized was there. Sarah sat back on her heels, utterly exhausted, but wearing a smile that transformed her entire face, from haunted to beautiful. She looked up at Wyatt and tapped her temple, then pressed her hand to her heart. The message was clear as spring water. She understood the horse's pain because she felt it herself, carried it in her own body like a scar that wouldn't heal. "Where in Sam Hill did you learn that?" Wyatt asked, forgetting for a moment that she wouldn't or couldn't answer with words. Sarah stood and moved to the barn wall where someone had left a piece of chalk. With careful, precise strokes that spoke of education beyond what most frontier girls ever received, she wrote, "Mother taught me before the fire. Said healing hands run in our blood." As Wyatt walked back to the house, dawn breaking over the distant mountains, he caught sight of fresh horse tracks in the soft earth near the gate tracks that hadn't been there when he'd gone to bed. The hoof prints were shod with distinctive square nails, the kind used by the territorial marshal's office. Someone had been watching. In a land where privacy was a man's most precious possession, that someone had a reason for lurking in the shadows like a coyote studying a henhouse. And in Wyatt's experience, those reasons were never good. Sheriff Mercer Thorne arrived the next morning like a plague of locusts, his deputy and 4 hired guns flanking him as he rode into Wyatt's yard with all the ceremony of a conquering general. At 45, Thorne was silver-haired and steel-eyed, wearing his badge like a crown, and his authority like armor that had never known a dent. His reputation preceded him like the stench of sulfur, a man who bent the law to fit his needs and broke those who opposed him. Stories followed in his wake, homesteaders driven from their land by legal technicalities, business owners who refused his protection, mysteriously burned out witnesses who disappeared into the desert and were never seen again. And Callahan, Thorne said, not bothering to dismount from his silver-adorned stallion. His voice carried the cultured accent of a man educated back east, though his soul was pure frontier predator. "Heard you made yourself quite the purchase at yesterday's auction." "Last I checked, that wasn't against the law," Wyatt replied, stepping onto his porch with coffee in hand. He kept his movements casual, but his gun belt was strapped on tight, and Jake had positioned himself in the barn doorway with his shotgun within easy reach. "Depends on what you bought, doesn't it?" Thorne's smile was sharp as a razor blade. "See, I got word you're harboring a runaway. Girl by the name of Sarah Whitford. Her guardian has been looking for her. Her guardian sold her like a piece of livestock. I got the papers to prove it." But see, that's where it gets interesting." Thorne pulled a folded document from his vest with the flourish of a stage magician. "Got a telegram from Judge Morrison in Austin just this morning. Seems that auction wasn't properly sanctioned by the territorial authorities. Any sales of human property are hereby declared null and void." Wyatt's jaw tightened. Judge Morrison was Thorne's brother-in-law, a fact that made any legal challenge about as useful as spitting into a tornado. The corruption ran deeper than a mine shaft and was twice as deadly. "That girl's under my protection now. Your protection? Thorne's laugh was like breaking glass, mixed with the sound of coffin nails being hammered home. Boy, you're living on borrowed time as it is. This spread of yours sits on mighty fine land. Water rights, mineral rights, grazing rights, all very valuable to the right buyer. Shame if something were to happen to muddy your claim. Behind Thorne, Deputy Amos Hale shifted uncomfortably in his saddle, his youthful face tight with internal conflict. At 25, Hale still possessed something rare in Thorne's organization, a functioning conscience. He'd been the sheriff's deputy for 3 years, and the job was eating him alive from the inside like spiritual cancer. "Sheriff," Hale said quietly, his voice strained with the effort of maintaining composure. "Maybe we should head back to town. Folks will be wondering where we... Maybe you should keep your mouth shut unless you want to find yourself walking a beat in some godforsaken border town where the Apache use lawmen for target practice." Thorne snapped his cultured mask, slipping to reveal the predator beneath. As the sheriff and his entourage rode away in a cloud of dust and menace, Wyatt caught sight of Sarah, watching from the barn window. Her face was pale as moonlight, but her eyes held something that surprised him. Not fear, but cold, calculating determination. She knew something about Thorne, something that made her small hands clench into fists and her jaw set in a hard line that reminded him of her mother's photograph. When the dust settled, Sarah emerged from the barn, carrying her piece of chalk. She walked to the barn wall and wrote in letters large enough for both men to read, "He killed my mother." I saw his face in the firelight. The market day in San Jacinto dawned hot and dusty, with merchants setting up their stalls in the town square, despite the tension that had been building like thunderclouds for weeks. Sarah had convinced Wyatt to let her come into town. She needed supplies she'd written on her slate. And besides, she was tired of hiding like a frightened rabbit in a hole. The market buzzed with nervous energy that reminded Wyatt of the moments before a cavalry charge. Families clustered around vegetable stalls and cloth merchants, but their conversations died when Thorne's men rode through on patrol, their eyes scanning the crowd like wolves hunting for the weakest sheep. Sarah was examining a bolt of blue fabric that reminded her of her mother's Sunday dress when she heard the commotion, men's voices raised in anger. Then the crash of overturning stalls and the sound of merchandise scattering across the dusty ground. 3 of Thorne's hired guns had cornered old Miguel Santos, the Mexican vendor who sold leather goods from a family tradition stretching back 5 generations. Miguel was a gentle soul who'd never harmed a fly, but his leather was the finest in the territory, and his refusal to pay Thorne's protection tax had made him a target. "So sheriff says you ain't paid your protection money this month, old man," snarled the leader, a gap-toothed brute named Carter, whose breath could kill a man at 20 paces. His scarred hands spoke of a violent past, and his dead eyes suggested a future filled with more of the same. "I paid last week, I paid." Miguel protested, his weathered hands shaking as he tried to gather his scattered goods. "I have receipt, my wife, she counted the money twice." Carter's backhand sent the old man sprawling into his scattered leather goods, blood streaming from his split lip. "Maybe your receipt got lost in a fire, old man. Maybe your memory ain't what it used to be." That's when Marcus Brennan stepped forward, his 8-year-old son Tommy clutching his shirt in fear. A prospector with hands like iron and a temper to match Marcus had lost his gold claim to Thorne's legal maneuvering, and the year before watching his life's work disappear into the sheriff's pocket like smoke. "Leave him be," Marcus said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd faced down claim jumpers and lived to tell about it. "Miguel's paid his dues. We all have. Question is, where does that money go?" "This ain't your business, Brennan." Carter growled, his hand dropping to his gun butt in a gesture that had intimidated lesser men. "Any man gets bullied in my town, it's my business. And this is still our town, no matter what Thorne thinks." The first punch flew like lightning, and suddenly the market erupted in chaos that had been building for months. Citizens who'd endured Thorne's tyranny for years finally had enough. Stalls overturned, vegetables flew through the air like artillery, and men grappled in the dust while women hurried children to safety. Sarah pressed herself against a wall, her heart pounding as she watched the violence unfold. But her eyes weren't on the brawl, they were fixed on Deputy Hale, who sat his horse at the edge of the square like a man watching his own execution. His hand rested on his gun butt, but his face was twisted with the kind of indecision that could tear a man's soul in half. When Carter drew his pistol aiming at Marcus Brennan's unprotected back while the prospector fought another man, Sarah saw Hale's hand twitch toward his weapon, then stop paralyzed by the weight of his own compromised position. The gunshot came from an unexpected source. Wyatt Callahan stepped out of the general store, smoke curling from his Colt like incense from an avenging angel's altar. Carter's gun flew from his shattered hand, and the man howling and clutching his wounded wrist while his weapon landed in a horse trough with a splash. "Market's closed, boys," Wyatt said with deadly calm, his second gun appearing in his left hand with the smooth efficiency of long practice. "Time to move along before I decide to make this permanent." Carter's two companions helped him to his feet, but their leader wasn't finished. "Thorne don't pay us enough for this," he snarled through gritted teeth. "But he pays enough to remember faces Callahan. Your time's coming." The brawl broke up as quickly as it had started, but the damage was done. Thorne's authority had been challenged publicly, and everyone knew there would be consequences. The sheriff didn't forgive, and he never forgot. That night, as Sarah tended to the horses by lamplight, a young woman slipped into the barn, like a shadow fleeing from moonlight. Emma Chen, 17, and daughter of the town's Chinese laundress, had been watching Sarah from afar since the market incident, her heart heavy with secrets that had been eating her alive for years. "I know who you are," Emma whispered, glancing nervously at the door, as if expecting demons to burst through at any moment. "I was there the night your house burned. I saw you running through the smoke, your nightgown on fire." Sarah's hand went to her throat, her eyes wide with shock that someone else remembered that terrible night. She grabbed her slate and wrote quickly, her chalk scratching against the surface like claws. "You saw me. Sheriff Thorne came to our laundry the next day. Said if anyone asked, you died in the fire with your mother. Said terrible things would happen to my family if we talked." Emma's voice shook like a leaf in a storm. "But I seen what's in your eyes, same as what's in mine. We both know what kind of monster he is." Sarah wrote again, her hand trembling. "What else did you see?" "A young deputy helped him that night. Younger than Deputy Hale is now. Carried the torches that started the fire. I saw him throw one through your mother's bedroom window." Emma's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I'm sorry I never said nothing before. I was scared they'd burn us out too." Sarah reached out and squeezed the girl's hand, finding it cold as winter stone. On her slate she wrote, "Fear kept us both alive, but truth will set us free." "There's more," Emma whispered, pulling a small bundle from her shawl. "I saved this from the fire. Thought maybe someday someone would need to see it." She unwrapped the bundle to reveal a man's handkerchief, white silk, embroidered with the initials IMT in gold thread. But more importantly, it was stained with blood that had dried to a rusty brown, but told a story that could hang a man. "He cut himself breaking through your back door," Emma explained. "Left this behind when he ran. I was hiding in the woodshed behind your house, too scared to move." Sarah stared at the handkerchief as if it were a serpent ready to strike. This was evidence, real tangible proof of Thorne's crime. But it was also a death sentence for anyone who possessed it. 2 days later, 8-year-old Tommy Brennan went missing in the Box Canyons east of town, disappearing like smoke on the wind during what should have been a simple afternoon fishing trip. A search party formed before sunset, led by his frantic father, Marcus. But after 8 hours of combing the rocks and ravines by torchlight, they found nothing but scattered equipment and the terrifying silence of the desert. Tommy's mother was near collapse when they brought her the boy's fishing pole broken and bloodied. Marcus was talking about riding into Apache territory to look for his son, ready to face whatever dangers lurked in those cursed hills. Sarah studied the ground with an intensity that made hardened trackers take notice. She knelt beside patches of disturbed earth that others had missed her fingers tracing patterns in the dust. that told stories only she could read. Her mother had taught her to track when she was barely old enough to walk, saying that silence taught you to see what others missed. When she stood, she pointed toward a narrow defile that the search party had deemed too dangerous to explore, a crack in the canyon wall that looked like God himself had split the rock with a lightning bolt. "You think he went that way?" Wyatt asked, recognizing the certainty in her movements. Sarah nodded emphatically, then knelt to write on a flat rock with her chalk horse tracks. Small boy. Something scared them both. Deputy Hale had joined the search, his face haggard with exhaustion, and something else, guilt perhaps, or shame that ran deeper than any canyon. When he saw Sarah's chalk marks and followed her pointing finger, he studied the sign with growing interest and mounting dread. "She's right," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won knowledge. "Look here, drag marks where something heavy was pulled across the rocks. And there's cloth caught on this mesquite bush. Blue cotton like the boy's shirt." The three of them, Wyatt, Sarah, and Hale, followed the faint trail deeper into the canyon, leaving Marcus to coordinate the main search effort. The walls rose around them like prison bars, blocking out the stars and trapping the desert's heat like a furnace. Sarah moved like a ghost, reading sign that no one else could see, her head cocked, as if listening to voices only she could hear. They were halfway through the canyon, the walls so narrow that a man could touch both sides with outstretched arms, when the ambush came. Rifle fire cracked from the rim rock above, bullets whining off stone inches from their heads in a deadly symphony. Wyatt dove behind a boulder, pulling Sarah with him, while Hale scrambled for cover behind a fallen tree that provided precious little protection. "Thorne's men!" Hale shouted over the gunfire, his badge catching the muzzle flashes like a target. "They followed us, it's a trap." Sarah pressed herself against the rock, her heart hammering like a blacksmith's anvil. In her mind, she could hear her mother's voice, cutting through the chaos. "When cornered, little mouse, you fight like a mountain lion. Tooth and claw and pure fury." She pulled her mother's knife from her belt and gripped it until her knuckles went white. The firefight was brief but vicious, echoing through the canyon like thunder trapped in a bottle. Wyatt's rifle spoke 4 times in rapid succession, and 2 of Thorne's men tumbled from the canyon walls like broken dolls. A third tried to flee, but Jake's distinctive shotgun boom from the canyon mouth cut him down before he'd gone 10 yards. The 4th gunman, realizing he was outmatched and outgunned, fled on horseback into the maze of canyons beyond dust, rising in his wake like the ghost of his courage. "Why?" Hale demanded, emerging from cover with his gun still drawn and his hands shaking with adrenaline. "Why ambush a search party looking for a missing boy? Because they don't want us finding what we're looking for," Wyatt said grimly, checking his rifle for damage. "Question is, what are they trying to hide?" They found Tommy Brennan wedged in a crack between 2 massive boulders, unconscious but breathing. His horse lay 30 feet away with a broken leg and a bullet wound the poor animal had been shot to prevent the boy from riding home. The story became clear as they examined the scene. Tommy had been thrown when his horse was shot, struck his head on the rocks, and crawled into the narrow space, seeking shelter from the desert sun. Without Sarah's tracking skills and the courage to enter the canyon despite the obvious danger, the boy would have died in that stone prison, another victim of Thorne's ruthless quest for control. As they carried Tommy back toward the main search party, Hale walked beside Sarah, his face troubled by thoughts that seemed to weigh more than mountains. "How did you know?" he asked. "How did you see what the rest of us missed?" Sarah stopped and wrote on the back of her dusty hand with her finger, "When you can't scream, you learn to see everything else. Silence teaches you to read the world like a book." It was Jake who found the water tank shot full of holes the next morning. 200 gallons of precious water seeping into the thirsty earth like lifeblood from a mortal wound. The cut fence lines came to light an hour later, their cattle scattered across 10 miles of rough country. Some already bearing the marks of rival brands burned over their rightful ownership. "This is just the beginning," Jake said, spitting tobacco juice into the dust with the disgust of a man who'd seen this dance before. "Thorne's testing us, seeing how much we'll take before we break. Next comes the night riders, then the mysterious fires. Hell, I've seen this play out from Colorado to Mexico." Sarah was drawing water from the creek when they came for her the second time. 4 riders thundering down from the mesa like the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Their faces masked with bandanas and their intentions written in the steel they carried. She heard the hoofbeats too late spinning around as rough hands reached for her like claws from hell itself. But 13 years of silent vigilance had sharpened her reflexes to a razor's edge. Her mother's knife flashed in the sunlight, like divine retribution. The first rider screamed as the blade opened his arm from wrist to elbow, his blood painting his horse's neck crimson. The animal reared, throwing him into the creek with a splash that sent water cascading over the banks. The second man leapt from his saddle, but Sarah was already moving, darting between the horses like a dancer performing steps choreographed by survival itself. "Little bitch cut me." The wounded man yowled, struggling to his feet in the shallow water while his life leaked out through his fingers. "She cut me bad. Grab her." The second man snarled, lunging forward with hands that had grabbed too many unwilling victims. "Thorn wants her breathing." But he didn't say nothing about unmarked. Sarah dodged his grasp and slashed again, the knife catching him across the cheek and opening a red smile that would scar him for life. But the third and fourth riders were already behind her, working in practiced coordination born of too many similar jobs. The lasso dropped around her shoulders just as Wyatt's rifle cracked from the ridge like the voice of judgment itself. The rope thrower toppled from his saddle with a bullet through his chest, and the remaining men scrambled for their horses, fleeing into the Badlands with curses and threats trailing behind them like smoke from burning bridges. "You all right?" Wyatt asked, sliding down the rocky slope with his rifle still smoking and his eyes scanning for additional threats. Sarah nodded, but her hands were shaking as she cleaned her knife on her skirt, leaving streaks of red on the faded fabric. On the muddy creek bank, she wrote with a stick. "They said, 'Thorn wants me alive,' for questioning about something I know." Wyatt's face went hard as winter granite. "Then we better make sure he never gets the chance to ask his questions." The truth came out on a Sunday morning 3 weeks after the rescue, when Sarah was cleaning the barn and her mother's tin box slipped from the hay bale where she'd hidden it. The impact jarred the false bottom loose, a secret compartment her mother had crafted with her own hands during those final terrifying months. Suddenly, papers scattered across the straw-covered floor like autumn leaves bearing the secrets of the dead. Among the familiar items, the carved comb and the pressed flower. The blood-stained photograph lay a leather-bound ledger, its pages yellowed with age and heavy with the weight of dangerous knowledge. Sarah clutched it to her chest, her eyes wide with something between terror and desperate hope. This was what her mother had died protecting, what Thorn had killed, for what had cost so many innocent people their lives and livelihoods. "What is this?" Wyatt asked, gently kneeling beside her in the scattered straw. Sarah's hands trembled as she opened the ledger, revealing pages covered with careful handwriting in faded brown ink, a woman's hand recording dates, names, and amounts with meticulous precision. But as Wyatt read over her shoulder, the true horror of what he was seeing began to dawn like a blood-red sunrise. Read, March 15th, 1872. M. Thorn, 500, Whitford Homestead Deed Transfer forged. April 3rd, 1872. M. Thorn, 300, Morrison Cattle Brand Registration False Witness. May 12th, 1872. M. Thorn, $200, Brennan Mine Claim Documents backdated. June 8th, 1872. M. Thorn, 150, Santos Protection Payment Extortion. Page after page of bribes, payoffs, and illegal land transfers. A complete record of Sheriff Thorn's corruption, written in meticulous detail by a woman who had witnessed it all, and possessed the courage to document crimes that could hang half the territorial government. Sarah turned to the front of the ledger where a name was inscribed in careful script, Property of Elizabeth Whitford, Witness to Truth, 1871. Your mother kept these records. Wyatt breathed understanding, flooding through him like ice water in his veins. Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face, as she flipped to a page near the back where the entries abruptly stopped. The last line read, August 7th, 1872. House burned. Elizabeth dead. Sarah escaped. MT responsible. May God forgive him, for I cannot. But there was more, so much more, that it made Wyatt's blood run cold as mountain snow. As Sarah's fingers traced the final pages, he saw something that made his heart stop beating for several terrifying seconds, a separate section headed Thorn's Enforcers, followed by a list of names, dates, and descriptions of jobs done for blood money. His own name was there, written in Elizabeth Whitford's careful hand, W. Callahan. Various intimidation jobs, 1869-1872. Refused Henderson assignment. Possesses conscience despite corruption. Sarah, he said hoarsely, his voice barely above a whisper. I need to tell you something that's going to change how you see me. She looked up at him, and he saw in her storm cloud eyes that she'd already read it all. The knowledge was there, along with something else, not condemnation, but understanding. 10 years ago, I was different, younger, angrier, stupider. Wyatt's voice cracked like breaking glass. After the war, after watching my brother die at Powder River, I hired my gun to anyone who'd pay, including Thorn. Sarah's face had gone very still, but she didn't pull away or reach for her knife. She simply waited, giving him the space to confess sins that had been eating his soul for a decade. I did collections for him. Intimidation, burned out homesteaders who couldn't fight back. Never killed anyone directly, but I helped him steal the dreams of families who'd done nothing wrong except trust in the law. Sarah wrote on her slate with steady hands, who were the Hendersons? A farming family. Good people trying to make an honest living. Wyatt's hands clenched into fists that could have shattered stone. John Henderson had been my sergeant in the war, saved my life twice at Antietam. When Thorn ordered me to burn them out for refusing to sell their land, I finally understood what I'd become. On her slate, Sarah wrote, they died, all of them. John, his wife Mary, their 3 children burned alive in their own home while I was riding away thinking I'd done the right thing by refusing the job. His voice broke entirely. I cost them their lives, Sarah. Just like my cowardice cost your mother hers. But Sarah was shaking her head vigorously. She wrote furiously on her slate, Thorn killed them. Thorn killed my mother. You've been trying to make amends ever since. I can see it in how you saved me, how you treat Jake, how you risk everything for strangers. The sound of approaching horses cut their conversation short, like a knife through silk. Through the barn window, they saw Deputy Hale riding up alone, his face grim with purpose, and heavy with secrets of his own. Hale dismounted slowly, his every movement weighted with the gravity of a man finally ready to unburden his soul before God and witnesses. His hand never strayed far from his gun, but when he spoke, his voice carried the hollow echo of a man who'd been rehearsing these words for years. I know what you have in there, he said, nodding toward the ledger with the resignation of a condemned man. And I know what you think of me. I know because I've been thinking the same things about myself every night for 13 years. Sarah stood, her slate in hand, her eyes burning with 13 years of suppressed rage and grief. She wrote with strokes so hard the chalk cracked. You helped burn my home. You killed my mother. Yes. Hale said simply, the word falling from his lips like a stone into still water. I was 19, green as grass and twice as stupid. Thorn told me Elizabeth Whitford was a traitor selling information to Mexican raiders who were hitting ranches along the border. Said we were protecting innocent families from butchery. Sarah's hand went to the knife at her belt, her knuckles white with the force of her grip. Wyatt tensed, ready to intervene if necessary. But something in Hale's manner, the complete absence of self-defense or justification, gave him pause. I carried the torches. Hale continued, his voice breaking like a dam bursting under pressure. I watched that house burn, thinking I was doing my duty to God and country. It wasn't until the screaming started that I realized. God help me, I realized we'd made a mistake. A terrible, unforgivable mistake. Sarah pulled the knife, her knuckles white around the bone handle. On her slate, she wrote in letters that seemed to burn with their own fire. Neil. Hale looked at the blade, then at Sarah's face, and slowly dropped to his knees in the dust like a penitent before an altar. I deserve whatever you choose to do to me. But first, let me help you finish what your mother started. Let me help you bring Thorn to justice. Sarah, Wyatt said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. Revenge won't bring her back. It won't heal the wounds or fill the empty spaces in your heart. Sarah stood over Hale, the knife trembling in her hand like a leaf in a storm. For a long moment that stretched like eternity, the only sound was the wind whistling through the barn rafters and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. Then slowly she lowered the blade. On her slate she wrote words that seemed to glow with their own inner light. My mother taught me that justice and revenge are different things. Justice requires mercy. Revenge only creates more pain. Hale's shoulders shook with relief that seemed to pour from his very soul. Thank you. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to earn that mercy. I swear it on my mother's grave. Sarah knelt and helped him to his feet, then wrote on her slate, then help me end Thorn's reign. Help me give my mother's sacrifice meaning. Marcus Brennan arrived at sunset with news that chilled them all to the bone and confirmed their worst fears about the storm gathering around them. Thorns called in reinforcements from El Paso and Tucson. 30 men, all gunfighters with prices on their heads. They rode in this afternoon like a plague of locusts. He's making his move, Wyatt said grimly, checking his weapons with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd seen too many battles. But Marcus shook his head in shame written across his weathered features like a scarlet letter of guilt. There's more. I've been feeding Thorn information. About you, about the girl, about your plans and movements. Wyatt's hand dropped to his gun, but Marcus raised his hands peacefully, his face a mask of self-loathing and desperate resolve. He had my boy. Threatened to kill Tommy if I didn't cooperate, said he'd make it look like an Apache raid. Marcus's voice cracked with the weight of a father's impossible choices. But seeing that child nearly die in the canyon, knowing I helped put him in danger, I can't live with myself anymore. I'd rather die than betray another innocent soul. Sarah wrote on her slate with compassionate understanding. You did what any father would do. Love makes us all vulnerable. Thorn's planning to hit you tonight. Marcus continued, the words pouring from him like blood from a wound. Burn you out same as he did to Sarah's family 13 years ago. But this time, he wants her alive. Something about a ledger that could destroy him and half the territorial government. How many men does he have here? Hale asked, his lawman's mind already calculating odds and angles. 12 plus the sheriff himself. The rest are holding the town, making sure nobody interferes or rides for help. He's got the place locked down tighter than a federal prison. Jake emerged from the barn, his ancient shotgun gleaming in the fading light, and his face wearing the grim smile of a man who'd faced worse odds and lived to tell about it. Well, he said with gallows humor, 5 against 12 ain't the worst odds I've faced. Of course, usually I was younger, drunker, and didn't give a damn whether I lived or died. Sarah wrote quickly on her slate, her hand moving with the certainty of inspiration. We can't win by fighting, but we can win by being smarter. Thorn wants the ledger. Let's give it to him, along with a few surprises he'll never forget. What do you have in mind? Wyatt asked, recognizing the fierce intelligence that blazed in her storm cloud eyes, the same intelligence that had allowed her mother to document Thorn's crimes for years without being discovered. Sarah's eyes gleamed with something that reminded everyone present of her mother's indomitable spirit. On her slate she wrote, Mama always said the pen is mightier than the sword. Time to prove she was right. They came at midnight, like demons, from the deepest pits of hell. Torches blazing against the star-filled sky, and their horses' hooves drumming a rhythm of death on the hard ground. But the ranch was ready for them. Sarah had spent hours preparing her mother's ledger open beside her as she worked by lamplight, copying the most damning evidence onto separate sheets and hiding them throughout the buildings. Thorn's voice carried across the yard like the roar of a predator, finally confident of its kill. Callahan, send out the girl and that ledger, and maybe I'll let you live long enough to regret crossing me. Go to hell, Thorn. Wyatt called back from his position behind the stone well, his rifle loaded and ready. Come and take what you want if you think you're man enough. Have it your way, you stubborn fool. Thorn's cultured voice cracked with rage and anticipation. Oh, boys, burn them out. I want that girl alive, but the rest can roast like the pigs they are. The first volley of gunfire shattered the night, like the opening of Judgment Day itself. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness as Thorn's hired killers spread out around the ranch buildings, their rifles barking death and destruction. Wyatt and Jake returned fire from the house, while Hale and Marcus held the barn, their weapons spitting defiance into the face of overwhelming odds. But the real battle was just beginning, and Sarah Whitford had learned her lessons well from a mother who'd faced down corruption with nothing but courage and a pen. 4 of Thorn's men circled around to the back of the barn, torches in hand and murder in their hearts. They kicked in the rear door, expecting to find Sarah cowering in the darkness like a helpless victim. Instead, they found empty stalls and scattered hay until the oil-soaked fodder erupted in flames around them like the breath of an angry god. Sarah had turned Thorn's own tactic against him with deadly efficiency. The barn became a furnace that lit up the night sky, but she wasn't trapped inside like her mother had been 13 years before. She was already moving through the network of irrigation tunnels that Jake had dug during the Apache Wars, emerging behind Thorn's position with her mother's ledger clutched against her chest like a shield of truth. The sheriff stood silhouetted against the flames, his silver hair gleaming in the firelight like a demon's crown. "Burn them out," he shouted to his men, his cultured mask finally slipping to reveal the beast beneath. "I want that girl breathing, but the rest can burn in hell. Turn around, Thorn." The words cut through the chaos like a blade forged from righteous fury. The sheriff spun his gun, already clearing leather with the speed of a practiced killer. But Sarah was faster not with violence, but with words that cut deeper than any weapon ever forged. "I remember your voice," she said, her words carrying clearly across the burning yard despite the crackling flames and distant gunfire. "I remember the sound you made when my mother bit your hand as you dragged her from her bed. I remember your scream when she clawed your face." Thorn's face went white as bone dust, his gun wavering in his grip. "You can't. You don't speak. You're deaf and mute. Everyone knows that. I've been silent for 13 years, waiting for this moment. Waiting for the chance to speak the truth that killed my mother." Sarah held up the ledger, its pages fluttering in the heat from the burning barn like the wings of avenging angels. "My mother's work, your crimes, all of it documented in her careful hand. Give me that book or I'll finish what I started 13 years ago." Thorn snarled, his mask of civilization finally falling away completely. But before Thorn could raise his gun, one of his own men stepped forward from the shadows, a lean gunfighter named Cole, who'd ridden in from El Paso with death in his holsters and vengeance in his heart. "You killed my brother," Cole said to Thorn, his voice steady as mountain stone and twice as immovable. "Danny Morrison, Judge Morrison's boy. You told me he died in a hunting accident, but I found his letters. I know what really happened." Thorn's eyes darted between Sarah and the betraying gunfighter, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool desert night. "Cole, you don't understand the bigger picture here. I understand plenty." Cole's Colt appeared in his hand like magic summoned from the depths of hell itself. "Danny found out about the money you and his daddy been stealing from the territorial government. So you put a bullet in his head and called it an accident. Made his own father help cover it up by threatening to expose their partnership." The explosion of gunfire was deafening in the confined space. Cole's shot took Thorn in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his own weapon flying into the darkness. But the sheriff was a survivor, rolling behind a water trough as his carefully laid plans collapsed around him like a house of cards in a hurricane. That's when the real chaos began, and the night exploded into violence that would be talked about in saloons from Texas to California. Wyatt burst from the house like an avenging angel, his rifle spitting fire and death. Jake emerged from the smoke like a gray ghost, his shotgun roaring defiance at the forces of corruption. Hale and Marcus charged from their positions, their weapons blazing in the firelight. And from the direction of town came the sound of hoofbeats and angry voices, the citizens of San Jacinto, led by Tommy Brennan's schoolteacher, and armed with hunting rifles and 13 years of suppressed rage. The people had finally had enough of living in fear. In the midst of the battle, Sarah found herself face to face with Thorne once more. The sheriff had dragged himself upright, blood staining his expensive shirt, his gun trained on her heart with the desperation of a cornered wolf. "You've cost me everything," he snarled, his cultured accent cracking under the weight of his fury. "Just like your mother. She couldn't leave well enough alone either." "Good," Sarah replied, her voice carrying the strength of 13 years of suffering, transformed into purpose. That was always the point. Justice delayed is not justice denied. Thorne's finger tightened on the trigger, just as Wyatt's tackle carried both men to the ground in a tangle of limbs and fury. They rolled in the dust, fighting for the gun like wild animals, until Jake's shotgun barrel pressed against Thorne's temple with the finality of divine judgment. "That's enough killing for one night," Jake said with deadly calm, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. "Though Lord knows you got it coming in spades, you murdering snake." The shooting stopped as suddenly as it had started. Of Thorne's 30 hired killers, half were dead or wounded, the rest scattered to the winds like leaves before a storm. The great Sheriff Mercer, Thorne, terror of the territory and architect of corruption, knelt in the dust with his empire in ruins around him. Sarah walked over to where he crouched, the ledger still clutched in her hands like a sacred text. She opened it to the final page and showed him her mother's last entry. "The truth will outlive us all. Justice may be delayed, but it will not be denied." She was right. Sarah said softly, her voice carrying across the burning yard. "Your sins have caught fire tonight, Thorne. And from the ashes justice grows like flowers in spring." 3 weeks later, the territorial marshal arrived from Austin with federal warrants and a delegation of government officials whose faces bore the grim satisfaction of men finally able to clean house. Sarah's ledger had been copied and distributed to newspapers across the territory, and beyond, sparking investigations that reached all the way to Washington and shook the foundations of territorial government. Judge Morrison had been captured at the Mexican border with 2 saddlebags full of stolen money and a confession letter that detailed his cooperation with Thorne's schemes. His son Danny's body had been exhumed and properly examined, revealing the bullet hole that proved Cole's accusations true. The citizens of San Jacinto gathered in the town square for what they called the Day of Reckoning. Families whose land had been stolen received their deeds back. Fraudulent cattle brands were struck from the territorial records. Men who'd been driven from their homes began the long journey back to reclaim what was rightfully theirs. Emma Chen stood before the crowd and told her story of that terrible night 13 years ago, producing the blood-stained handkerchief that had haunted her dreams for so long. Her testimony, combined with Elizabeth Whitford's meticulous records, painted a picture of corruption so comprehensive that it reached into every corner of territorial life. Thorne himself sat in his own jail cell, his wounded shoulder healing slowly, while his dreams of empire crumbled to dust. The federal marshals would be taking him to Austin for trial, but everyone knew the outcome. The evidence was overwhelming, and the territory's appetite for justice had finally awakened like a sleeping giant. Deputy Hale, now Sheriff Hale, worked tirelessly to right the wrongs detailed in Elizabeth Whitford's careful handwriting. His badge, once tarnished by complicity, now gleamed with the polish of hard-won redemption. He'd hired Cole as his deputy, the gunfighter's skills redirected toward legitimate law enforcement. On the morning of Sarah's departure, the 5 of them gathered at the rebuilt barn that had witnessed so much pain and healing. The territorial government had offered Sarah a position in Santa Fe, establishing a school for children who, like herself, had been overlooked by a society that didn't understand their potential. "It's important work," she explained, her voice clear and strong in the morning air. "These children deserve to know they're not broken, just different. They deserve to know their voices matter even if they speak in ways others don't understand. Hale would be staying to rebuild the town's trust in the law, his penance taking the form of service to the people he'd once helped oppress. Marcus Brennan had been appointed as his second deputy, his courage during the final battle earning him the respect of his neighbors. Tommy was healing well his adventure in the canyon, already becoming legend among the local children. Wyatt and Jake were bound for Oregon, where a friend had promised them good grazing land and a chance to start fresh. The ghosts of their past would travel with them, but perhaps in that green country, they'd finally find peace. Before we go our separate ways, Sarah said, her voice carrying the weight of ritual and reverence, I want us to make a promise that will outlast our mortal frames. She led them to the new hitching post that had been erected to replace the one destroyed in the fire, its fresh wood unmarked by years of use. From her pocket, she pulled her mother's knife, the blade that had saved her life more than once, and now would serve a different purpose, a mark for each of us. She said, starting to carve her name into the wood with careful strokes. A promise that family isn't about blood. It's about standing together when the world burns around us. One by one, they carved their names: Sarah Whitford, Wyatt Callahan, Amos Hale, Jake Morrison, Marcus Brennan. And beneath them all, Sarah added one more name with reverent care, Elizabeth Whitford, for the woman whose courage had made their justice possible. When the carving was done, they exchanged gifts that carried the weight of memory and promise. Sarah gave Wyatt her mother's ledger, for when you need to remember that truth is worth fighting for, no matter the cost. She said, her eyes bright with unshed tears. To Hale, she gave her mother's small Bible, its pages worn smooth by faithful hands that had sought comfort in dark times, for guidance on the path to redemption. My mother always said the hardest person to forgive is yourself. Jake pressed his tobacco pouch into Sarah's hands, his weathered eyes misty with emotion that he'd kept buried for too many years. This belonged to my Martha, he said gruffly. She always said hope was like good tobacco, gets better with age, and there's always enough to share with those who need it. Hale offered his deputy's badge, the one he'd worn during his years of shame and compromise. Maybe someday you'll give this to someone who needs to remember that we all deserve a second chance, no matter how far we've fallen. Marcus gave Sarah a small wooden horse he'd carved for Tommy, who had insisted it go to the lady who'd saved his life. So you'll remember that sometimes being lost leads us to exactly where we need to be. As the sun climbed higher, painting the mesa in shades of gold and infinite promise, they prepared to part ways. The stagecoach to Santa Fe waited in town for Sarah, while Wyatt and Jake's wagon was loaded and ready for the long trail north to Oregon and new beginnings. Will we see each other again? Hale asked, his voice carrying the weight of a man who'd learned the value of the connections forged in fire. Sarah smiled, her hand resting on the carved post that would stand as monument to their bond. Family finds a way. Maybe not in this life, but somehow, someway the bonds we forge in truth endure beyond death itself. Wyatt mounted his black gelding, the horse that had carried him through so many battles and now would carry him toward peace. Take care of this place, Amos. Take care of these people. They've earned the right to live without fear. You taught me how. Hale replied, his badge catching the morning sunlight like a beacon. Both of you. You showed me what it means to serve something greater than yourself. As the wagons and riders began to move in different directions, Sarah called out one last time, her voice carrying across the desert like a prayer. Remember, family isn't blood. It's the people who stand with you when the world burns, who help you rise from the ashes, who believe in your truth when the whole world calls you a liar. Her words echoed across the vast landscape, carried by the desert wind, to places where other lost souls might hear them and take heart. In the distance, a hawk circled the mesa, its cry piercing the blue sky like a benediction from heaven itself. 5 years later, a woman in a blue dress that matched her storm cloud eyes stepped down from the Santa Fe stage, her gaze scanning the familiar landscape of San Jacinto with the wonder of someone seeing a beloved face after long absence. Sarah Whitford had returned not as the broken girl who'd been sold like livestock, but as an educator and advocate whose school for deaf children had become a model for the entire territory. The town had changed in ways that filled her heart with joy. Where once there'd been fear stalking the streets like a hungry predator, now children played freely in the dusty roads. The market square bustled with honest commerce, and the jail held only those who truly deserved to be there. Sheriff Hale's office bore a new sign carved in fine oak: "Justice for all, no exceptions." At the old ranch, she found the hitching post still standing, their carved names weathered, but legible, a testament to bonds that time could not break. A letter waited for her there, left by a passing cowboy who'd recognized her description and been paid handsomely to ensure its delivery. The letter was from Oregon, written in Wyatt's careful hand on paper that smelled of pine forests and new beginnings. "Sarah, the nightmares have stopped. Jake and I built a good life here, raising horses and memories both. Your mother would be proud of the woman you've become, the lives you've touched, the children you've given voices to. The seeds of justice you planted in that terrible desert have grown into a forest of hope. Until we meet again in this world or the next, Wyatt." Tucked inside was a smaller note from Jake, written in his distinctive scrawl. "Still got plenty of hope to share, and Martha's tobacco pouch is waiting for you. Come visit when the desert gets too quiet. The mountains here would welcome you home, Jay." Sheriff Hale found her there as the sun was setting, painting the western sky in shades of fire and gold that reminded her of that terrible night when justice had finally been served. His hair was grayer now, but his eyes were clearer than she'd ever seen them, the eyes of a man who'd found his way back to his own soul. "You came back," he said simply, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man whose faith had been rewarded. "Family finds a way," Sarah replied, doing her words from 5 years before, with a smile that could have lit up the darkest night. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint its masterpiece across the vast canvas of the western sky. In the distance, the church bell rang the evening hour, and somewhere a child laughed with the pure joy that only comes from growing up free from fear. "Was it worth it?" Hale asked quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a man who'd paid a heavy price for redemption. "All the pain, all the fighting, all the loss." Sarah touched the carved names on the post, her fingers tracing the letters of her mother's name with reverent care. "Truth always costs something," she said, her voice carrying the wisdom earned through suffering, transformed into purpose. "But the price of silence is always higher. My mother knew that when she started keeping those records. She knew it might cost her everything, but she also knew that some truths are worth dying for." As night fell over, the desert stars appeared one by one in the vast sky, like diamonds scattered across black velvet, each one a light in the darkness, a promise that dawn would come again, no matter how long the night might last. And in that moment, Sarah Whitford knew with absolute certainty that some bonds transcend time and distance. That some families are forged not in blood, but in fire. And that sometimes the greatest victory is not in conquering enemies, but in learning to forgive them. The wind whispered across the mesa, carrying with it the eternal promise of the American West, that in this land of endless horizons, any soul brave enough to seek it could find redemption, justice, and home. The age of silence was over. The time of truth had begun. And in the vast expanse of desert and dream, where legends were born from dust and determination, the story of Sarah Whitford would be told around campfires for generations to come, a tale of courage, justice, and the unbreakable bonds of chosen family. The desert had kept its secrets long enough. Now it was time for healing, for growth, for the kind of justice that plants seeds for future generations. And as the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient dance, Sarah Whitford smiled and whispered a prayer of gratitude to the mother whose love had made it all possible.